They called us prey. We called it Tuesday. The night Cale Voss ignored the Dominion's first transmission, he was standing on a folding chair in a community center in what used to be Warsaw, wearing a Spider-Man costume that was 2 sizes too small across the shoulders. The zipper had broken somewhere over the Atlantic, and the mask smelled like the inside of a gym bag. But the kids in the front row didn't care. They were laughing, and Cale hadn't made anyone laugh in a long time, so he kept going, kept doing the voice, kept pretending the crepe paper streamers were web lines, until the buzzing in his earpiece got loud enough that Happy couldn't be ignored anymore. They're calling again. Cale pulled the mask up over his nose. He looked at the kids. There were 14 of them, all between 6 and 12, all survivors of the culling, which was what humanity had started calling the first wave of Dominion strikes 3 years ago. The strikes that had taken approximately 2 billion people, gone in a matter of weeks, not with bombs or plagues, but with something worse, precision. The Dominion had studied Earth the way a surgeon studies a patient before removing a tumor. They knew which populations to take to break the rest. They knew which cities to hollow out, so the survivors would spend years just trying to feed themselves rather than resist. They were very, very good at this. Cale knew that. He'd been a materials engineer for a Zurich-based aerospace contractor when the culling happened, and he'd spent the first year doing what most survivors did, trying to figure out if the people he loved were still breathing. His mother, yes, his sister in Nairobi, yes, his best friend Tadashi in Tokyo. No, that blank space where Tadashi used to be had never filled in. Tell them I'm busy, Cale said. You're wearing a Spider-Man costume at a children's birthday party in Warsaw. Tell them I'm very busy. A pause. Then Happy's voice flatter. Cale, they've got something new. Rennick says it could change the whole board. Cale looked at the kids one more time. The birthday girl, Marta, 7 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a crown made of aluminum foil, was watching him with the particular patience that culling-era children had developed, which was to say, the patience of someone who had learned that adults disappeared without warning, and that it was better not to make a fuss about it. He stepped down from the folding chair. He pulled a packet of gummy worms from inside the costume and handed them to Marta. You're the captain now, he told her. She accepted this with a single nod, like she'd been waiting for the promotion. He was out the door 30 seconds later, the mask still around his neck, flagging down a transit rover on the slick Warsaw cobblestones while Happy fed him the coordinates. The thing you had to understand about the Dominion, the thing that took humanity's best tacticians most of the war to actually internalize, was that they didn't lie. Not out of any moral scruple. They simply considered deception beneath them. They were the Dominion. They had subjugated 43 civilizations across 6-star systems. Their military philosophy was built on the premise that superior force made subterfuge unnecessary. Why trick your prey when you can simply overwhelm it? It was, as it turned out, a significant blind spot. But in those early years, none of that was clear yet, and the resistance, what the media called the coalition, but what the people inside it called the patchwork, because that was what it was running on desperation and improvisation and the specific stubborn human refusal to accept that the math was this bad. Cale arrived at the patchwork's current Warsaw hub 40 minutes after leaving Marta's party. The hub was in the basement of what had been a furniture warehouse. 3 floors of IKEA flat packs still sat in the shelves above them like a monument to a world that used to debate whether to build the Kallax or the Expedit, and the ops room smelled like coffee and solder and the particular stress suite of people who hadn't been home in a long time. Commander Rennick was at the central table. She was a former British Army colonel who had lost her left hand to a Dominion drone strike in Edinburgh and had replaced it with a prosthetic that she'd modified herself, adding a small torch to the index finger because, she said, torches were useful, and everyone always forgot to bring one. She was 48 years old and had the eyes of someone who had done the math on every room she entered and decided she could survive it. You look ridiculous, she said. The kids loved it. Sit down, he sat. Around the table were 6 other people he recognized from various patchwork operations. A signals analyst from Sao Paulo, a former Dominion tech specialist who'd defected from the occupied territories, a young Dutch woman named Lena who had hacked 3 Dominion communication arrays with nothing but salvaged hardware and spite. They all looked at Cale with the expression he'd gotten used to, the one that was partly respect and partly something heavier. The one that said, "You're the one who survived the Hague." He hated that look. He hadn't survived the Hague because he was exceptional. He'd survived because he'd been in the bathroom when the attack hit, and the structural core of the building had shielded him. Luck. Pure bloody luck. But the patchwork needed symbols more than it needed accurate casualty attribution, so they'd turned him into one. He was trying to be worthy of it. That was the most honest thing he could say. "Tell me about the something new," he said. Rennick nodded to Lena. The Dutch woman pulled up a holographic display. They'd reverse-engineered the projection tech from a Dominion scout craft 18 months ago, which had given them a significant intelligence advantage. And at the center of it was a recording. A Dominion broadcast. Audio only, because their visual encoding was still a black box. "This went out 6 hours ago," Lena said. "Broadband across all occupied territories, not encrypted." They wanted it heard. She played it. The voice was the sound the Dominion used when they communicated with subject species. Not their actual voice, which was something between a subsonic pulse and a frequency that made your back teeth hurt, but a synthesized translation. It sounded like gravel being poured through a machine. To the feral remnant of the species designated H7, the Dominion is prepared to offer conditional integration. Representative Voraxen will meet with designated human leadership at the coordinates attached to this broadcast. Attendance is required. Failure to attend will be interpreted as continued hostility and will result in escalated response. The recording ended. Cale looked at the table. "Conditional integration," he said. "It's what they offered the Kreth before they finished them off," the Sao Paulo analyst said. "Come talk. Then they hit you while you're busy feeling hopeful." "Maybe," Rennick said. "Or maybe Voraxen is real and the offer is real." "You believe that?" Rennick's prosthetic hand made a small clicking sound as she flexed it, a habit Cale had noticed that she did when she was thinking. "I think the Dominion is capable of a genuine offer if they've determined that absorption is more efficient than extermination. And I think the coordinates they sent are for a location that we've been watching for 4 months." She paused. "The Dominion doesn't know we've been watching it." Cale felt something shift in his chest. "What's at the location?" "A staging facility," Lena said. "But not for soldiers, for drones. Hundreds of them, maybe more. Projection drones. The kind they used in the early strikes. They don't need to kill you directly. They just need to make you see things that aren't there and drive you somewhere that they are." "Psychological warfare hardware," the defector said quietly. "Voraxen runs a subdivision of the Dominion that specializes in breaking species before the final push. They don't want to fight you. They want you to give up. They manufacture despair." Nobody spoke for a moment. "So the meeting is a trap," Cale said. "They invite us to negotiate while those drones are staged to either hit us directly or deploy the moment the talks break down to demoralize the rest of the population." "That's our read," Rennick said. "And you want me there. You're the best infiltration specialist we have." "I'm a materials engineer who got lucky in The Hague." "You're a materials engineer who got lucky in The Hague and then spent 3 years learning everything there was to know about Dominion construction because you were too stubborn to stop and too angry to quit." Rennick looked at him steadily. "You're also the only person who's been inside a Dominion staging facility and come back." He hadn't come back entirely intact from that one. He still heard a high-pitched tone in his left ear when it rained. "What's the play?" he asked. "We go to the meeting genuinely. We send a small team, you included, as the designated representative party. But before the meeting, you and Lena get inside that staging facility and you find the drone command array and destroy it and turn it around." Cale was quiet for a moment. "You want me to reprogram Dominion psychological warfare drones to run against their own operators. We want you to give Voraxen a taste of what they plan to give us." Rennick's expression didn't change. "You understand their construction. Lena understands their code architecture. Between you, we think it's possible. It's insane." "Yes. The margin for error is essentially 0. If they detect us before we can flip the command array, there's no exit." "Correct. And if we succeed, Voraxen walks into a meeting thinking they have a weapon pointed at us, and they find out it's pointed at them instead." "That's the idea." Cale looked down at the Spider-Man mask still hanging around his neck. He thought about Marta and her aluminum foil crown. He thought about 14 kids who'd grown up knowing the world could be unmade in 6 weeks by something from the sky. He thought about Tadashi. "All right," he said. "Walk me through the facility layout." The coordinates were in what had been northern Slovakia, a shallow valley between 2 ridge lines. the kind of landscape that looked from above like it wasn't concealing anything interesting. That was the point. The Dominion had a preference for locations that bored human observers. They had profiled humanity's attention patterns with the same clinical precision they'd applied to everything else about the species. They had not, apparently, profiled Lena's attention pattern specifically. The Dutch woman had been watching the valley for 4 months through a network of salvaged microsatellites she'd stitched together with open source code and a level of patience that Kale found mildly frightening. She'd mapped the patrol schedules. She'd identified a ventilation channel on the facility's eastern face that the Dominion had built for temperature regulation, and apparently never considered a vulnerability, because no species they'd encountered before had been small enough to exploit it. Human adults were in several meaningful ways quite small. They went in at 3 in the morning, which was not a time the Dominion kept watch with any particular rigor, because on every planet they'd ever occupied, the dominant species had retreated indoors after dark. It was another thing they'd gotten wrong about humans, or at least about humans in winter Slovakia, who had spent 3 years learning that the dark was sometimes the safest place to be. Kale went first. The ventilation channel was approximately the width of his shoulders and smelled like metal and ozone, and something that he'd learned to associate with Dominion technology, a faint sweetness, like burnt sugar, that he still didn't have a chemical explanation for. He moved slowly. He moved in the way that he'd learned to move in tight spaces, which was less a physical technique and more a mental one. Stop thinking about how tight the space is and start thinking about what's on the other side. Behind him, Lena made no more sound than a cat. The facility's interior was larger than the approach had suggested. The Dominion built deep. They were, apparently, a species that had evolved on a planet with significant surface instability, which gave them a deep architectural preference for underground construction. Kale had learned this from the defector, who had told him 17 things about Dominion biology and psychology in a 2-hour briefing that had fundamentally changed how he thought about the enemy. They weren't invincible. They were a specific kind of creature with specific instincts and specific blind spots. The drone bay was on the second subfloor. He saw it through a grated panel in the ceiling, a vast dark space full of hovering machines, each roughly the size of a car wheel, perfectly still in their charging cradles. Hundreds of them, possibly more. They carried no visible weapons. Their menace was entirely in what they contained, which was the capacity to project onto the human visual cortex anything the operator chose. Anything. Your worst memory. The faces of everyone you'd lost. A version of the world in which resistance was not only futile but laughable, in which humanity was small and fragile and already broken. The Dominion had learned from 43 previous civilizations exactly how to make a species give up without firing a single shot. They hadn't met a species that had already been this badly broken and was still going. There, Lena whispered, pointing. Across the drone bay, elevated on a platform that gave it clear line of sight to the entire array, was the command terminal. Black, angular, pulsing with a slow blue light that Kale had come to associate with active Dominion systems. I can get to it, he said. The drop to the floor is 4 meters. I know, if anything moves. I know. He looked at her. She looked back. She was 26 years old and had the particular stillness of someone who had made peace with being scared. Give me 15 minutes on the terminal, she said. I need to map the command architecture before I can invert it. Keep them off me. Keep them off you, Kale repeated. Right. He found the access panel. He dropped. 4 meters is not a fall that kills you, but it's a fall that makes a noise, and noise is a problem. And for approximately 3 seconds after he hit the floor, Kale was utterly certain that every drone in the bay was going to come alive at once, and that this was going to be the stupidest way in recorded history for a materials engineer to die. Nothing moved. He exhaled. He crossed the floor to the terminal platform and looked up. Lena descended behind him, controlled, nearly silent, landing with her weight on the balls of her feet. She was at the terminal, in 4 steps, her modified datapad already connecting to the Dominion interface port that the defector had told them about. A diagnostic input that existed because even the Dominion needed to perform maintenance, and maintenance required access. Humanity had spent 3 years getting very good at finding the maintenance inputs. While Lena worked, Kale moved around the perimeter of the bay. He wasn't defending against anything yet. He was doing something he'd learned to do in the field, which was to look at things long enough that he understood them rather than just observed them. He looked at the drones. He looked at their charging configurations. He looked at the way they were arranged relative to each other and relative to the exit ports in the ceiling. He'd seen these units deployed once before in a recording taken by a resistance operative in occupied Lyon who hadn't survived the operation but had gotten the footage out. He'd watched it maybe 30 times. He knew what the drones looked like when they activated. He knew what the projections looked like. He knew the particular way that a human mind responded to a reality that had been quietly replaced with something that wasn't real. The disorientation, the vertigo, the terrible convincingness of it, the way you'd reach out and touch the thing that wasn't there and your hand would pass through and your brain would simply refuse to accept that. He thought about what it was going to feel like, standing across from Voraxen in 6 hours, knowing this array had been flipped. A sound, not a drone, something else. A footstep, heavy, deliberate, at the far end of the bay. Kale was behind a support column in less than a second. He pressed himself against the metal and he did not breathe. In the dim blue light, he could see the source of the footstep. A Dominion maintenance worker, bipedal but broad, moving through the bay with the unhurried confidence of something that had never, in its professional life, encountered a threat it wasn't expecting. He looked at Lena. She had not looked up. Her hands were moving. The datapad was speaking to the terminal. He held up a hand. Wait. The maintenance worker moved along the far wall, checking connections or charging levels or whatever it was. Dominion maintenance workers checked. It was maybe 30 meters away. It hadn't looked in their direction. 30 meters in a silent room felt like 30 centimeters. Kale did not think about dying. He thought about the specific structural properties of the support column he was behind. A hardened alloy, Dominion standard construction, rated for significant impact loads based on the cross-section. He thought about the floor grating between him and the maintenance worker, and whether it would transmit vibration if he moved. He thought about the angle of the ambient lighting, and whether his shadow was falling somewhere visible. This was the thing about fear he'd found. The more specifically you thought about the physical details of your immediate environment, the less bandwidth your brain had for the drowning. It was not a cure, but it was a technique. The maintenance worker finished its circuit. It turned. It walked back the way it had come, disappearing through a door at the far end of the bay. Kale exhaled. 8 minutes later, Lena straightened from the terminal. She looked at him. She tapped her temple twice, the signal they'd agreed on. Done. The meeting was scheduled for noon. They were out of the facility by 5 a.m., back to the extraction point by 6:30, on a scrambled comms line to Rennick by 7. Kale ate a protein bar and changed his clothes and tried to sleep for 2 hours in the back of a transit rover, and mostly just lay there watching the ceiling. He'd spent 3 years not thinking too much about what would happen if anything actually worked. The mind he'd found was surprisingly resistant to hope. Hope was a specific kind of vulnerability. You built it up, and then something Dominion-shaped walked through it, and the damage was worse than if you'd never hoped at all. So he'd gotten very good at not projecting forward, at treating each day as its own sealed unit, at caring about exactly one thing, the work in front of him. But lying in the back of that rover with the Slovak countryside blurring past the scratched window, he let himself think about it for a moment. Just a moment. About what it would mean if this worked. About what a room full of Dominion delegation staff looked like when the thing they'd aimed at the enemy turned on them. He was almost smiling when he fell asleep. Voraxen was not what Kale had expected, which said something useful about his expectations. He'd imagined, from the recordings, from the defectors' descriptions, something that radiated dominance, massive, armored, the physical incarnation of 3 conquered civilizations. What met them in the designated meeting space, a neutral building in the valley that the Dominion had apparently selected from human architectural surveys because it was what they believed humans considered formal, was something different. Voraxen was perhaps 2.5 meters tall. The body was insectoid in its segmentation but vertebrate in its posture, and the eyes, 4 of them in a horizontal row, were a deep violet that somehow communicated intelligence without communicating anything like warmth. They wore no visible armor. Their delegation was 6 individuals, none of them armed in any way Kale could detect. This was either a genuine gesture of good faith or the most elegant form of arrogance he'd ever encountered. The Dominion brought no weapons, because they were the weapon. Rennick sat across from Voraxen at the table. Kale sat 2 seats down, with Lena beside him. The Sao Paulo analyst and 2 others rounded out the human delegation. They were all carrying exactly what they appeared to be carrying. They were, on the surface, a collection of battered human survivors trying to negotiate the survival of a species that had taken a catastrophic beating. Vorak Sen began. The translation was provided by the same synthesizing system from the broadcast, gravel through a machine. The Dominion acknowledges the H7 remnant's continued resistance as a data point. You are a tenacious species. This has been noted. Our offer is conditional integration, by which we mean the following. Kale stopped listening to the content and watched the body language instead. He'd read everything he could find about Dominion behavioral cues, which was not much, because most of the people who'd observed them closely hadn't filed reports afterward. But the defector had described a particular gesture, a slow lateral movement of the outermost pair of eyes that indicated anticipation, waiting for something. Vorak Sen's outer eyes moved, slowly, laterally, and then Lena's hand found Kael's knee under the table and pressed once. It had started. Later, when Kael tried to describe it, he always struggled with the sequence. The drones activated on the signal Lena had embedded in the command array. Not the signal Vorak Sen had planned to send, but the one that Lena had reprogrammed the array to execute on the Dominion's own trigger, which meant that when Vorak Sen, at whatever point in the meeting they'd planned, sent the command to begin the psychological assault on the human delegation, they sent it to themselves. The projections came up in the Dominion delegation section of the room, not in the human section. Not hallucinations designed for human neurology. These were calibrated for Dominion neurology, which Lena had mapped from the command architecture in the terminal, which had contained within it targeting profiles for every species the Dominion had used these drones against, including themselves, because the Dominion had apparently once used these weapons in a civil conflict and had never deleted the calibration data. This was, Kale thought later, the single most useful piece of sloppiness he had ever encountered. He never knew exactly what Vorak Sen saw. The defector, reviewing the footage afterward, made a sound that took Kale a moment to identify as a laugh. Their own dead, she said, the ones they lost in the civil conflict. The 43 they took, all of them, reversed. A record of every civilization they ended, presented as a kind of reckoning. She paused. They do not have a concept of this. They have never had to reckon with anything. What Kale saw from his side of the table was something he would carry for a long time. The Dominion delegation, all 6 of them, going absolutely still, and then Vorak Sen making a sound that wasn't meant for human ears, a frequency that hit somewhere behind Kale's sternum, and reaching for something at their side that wasn't a weapon, but might have been a communications device. And Rennick's voice, very calm, cutting through the room. All illusions are down. She was looking directly at Vorak Sen. Her prosthetic hand was flat on the table. The torch on her index finger, which she never turned on during meetings, was on. Whatever you're seeing right now, Rennick said, we didn't put it there. Your own system put it there. The system you built to break us. And before you reach for anything, I want you to understand something about the species you've been trying to suppress. She paused. We didn't do this because we're powerful. We did this because we're stubborn and patient. And we are very, very good at finding the maintenance inputs. The Dominion translator made its gravel sound. Kale didn't know if that was Vorak Sen responding or just the system cycling. The projections in the Dominion section were still running. Lena had set a timer, not a kill switch, because you wanted the effect to land fully. 2 of the 6-person delegation had physically moved backward in their seats. 2 more were communicating in subsonic frequencies that Kale could feel in his chest. Vorak Sen had not moved at all. Their outer eyes, Kale noticed, had stopped their lateral movement. What happened in the 37 minutes after that was not, as it turned out, the end of the war. Kale would have to explain this to a lot of people over the following weeks, and it was a harder explanation than the victory narrative people wanted. The Dominion did not fold. They did not, in some movie-ending reversal, decide that humanity was too much trouble and leave. Vorak Sen was shaken. That much was clear, and it was operationally significant, because a shaken commanding officer makes different decisions than a confident one. But they were not broken. What changed was the calculation. The Dominion had, in all previous encounters, operated from a certainty that resistance was a phase, a predictable arc, initial pushback, resource depletion, morale collapse, conditional surrender. The civil conflict in their own history was the only exception, and they had, apparently, never fully updated their strategic models to account for what happened when a species refused to follow the arc. Humanity was not following the arc. They had taken 2 billion casualties, and they were still in the room. They had infiltrated a military staging facility with 2 people and a piece of salvaged hardware, and had flipped a weapon system in one night. They had sat across from the Dominion and smiled. Kale had not smiled. He was not that kind of optimist. But Rennick had, slightly, and Rennick was not a woman who performed anything, so when she smiled, it meant the math had changed. The negotiations that followed the meeting were not swift. They were not triumphant. They were the kind of grinding, frustrating, infuriating process that looked, from the outside, like nothing much happening for a very long time, which was fine. Humanity had learned to do nothing much happening for a long time very well. It was basically the signature skill at this point. 3 months after the meeting, the Dominion withdrew from 2 of the 7 occupied territories. Rennick called it a recalibration. The defector called it the first time in recorded Dominion history that they had deoccupied anything. The Sao Paulo analyst called it a miracle, and then looked embarrassed, and then said it again. Kale was in Warsaw when he heard. He was at Marta's next birthday party. She was 8 now, and the crown was still aluminum foil, but she'd added ribbon, and Happy called him and told him, and for a moment the noise of the party and the noise of the news were the same noise, and he couldn't separate them. He found a quiet corner. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, the way he used to sit in the ventilation channel of a Dominion facility in Slovakia, and he let himself feel it. Not victory, not yet, but something in the same family as hope. The question he got asked most often in the months that followed was some version of, "How did you know it would work?" He always gave the same answer, which was that he hadn't. He'd had a 60% confidence level, maybe, which was a technical way of saying that roughly half the time the plan would have ended with 2 humans dead in a Slovak facility and the Dominion exactly where they'd been before. But the real answer was something he'd figured out in that drone bay, lying flat on the floor with a Dominion maintenance worker 30 meters away, working through the structural properties of his cover in his head to keep the drowning from starting. The Dominion had studied humanity for years. They'd modeled population dynamics, resource dependencies, psychological vulnerabilities, biological tolerances. They had data on everything. What they didn't have, and couldn't have, because it didn't appear anywhere in their models, was the specific quality of mind produced by a species that had been building things and breaking them and building them differently for 100,000 years. The quality of mind that, when faced with an overwhelming force, didn't look for an overwhelming counterforce, but started looking for the maintenance inputs, the loose bolt, the legacy data that should have been deleted, the ventilation channel that was slightly too wide. They'd modeled the capacity for resistance. They hadn't modeled the capacity for improvisation. And improvisation, the specific, stubborn, unglamorous kind, the kind that got its hands dirty and didn't ask for credit and ran on spite as often as inspiration, was maybe the most human thing there was. He thought about Tadashi sometimes. When he was trying to explain this, Tadashi had been an engineer, not a resistance fighter, not a hero, just a person who spent his days figuring out why things didn't work and making them work anyway. He would have been very good in that facility. He would have found something Kale had missed, but he hadn't been there. And so Kale had done it for him, imperfectly, with a 60% confidence level, and a broken Spider-Man costume, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided, somewhere in the ruins of The Hague, that the math was wrong, and he was going to prove it. The 2 territories came back online slowly. There was a lot of rebuilding to do. There was, in the nature of things, going to be a lot more. But Marta got to have a birthday party, and Kale was there for it. And when she put the aluminum foil crown on his head, declaring him, with 7-year-old authority, the night of the party, he didn't take it off. It stayed on his head for the rest of the afternoon, slightly crooked, catching the light. He figured he'd earned it.